Well, it is my pleasure to moderate the first panel. I think we have an amazing array of speakers on democratic backsliding and stalled reform, the case for democracy and peaceful reforms. We have Shadi, Hamid, all of them. I'm not going to read their bios. You have their bios in the program booklet. And most of them don't need any introduction. So we're going to try to keep it on time. We have Shadi Hamid speaking about, does dictatorship first policy actually work? We have David Mednikov about authoritarianism and the fall of international order. We have Sultan Al-Amir from what happened to the Arab Spring and where are the Arab Democrats. Maybe he can help us find them. We have Murad Batal Shishani from Can Democracy Prevent Extremism? And finally, Ammar Mansouri from a US Strategy in India and the Limits of Order Without Democracy. So 5 excellent speakers and panelists. Please keep it to 10 minutes because we want to leave at least 15, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. And we'll start with Shadi.
Thanks so much, Ridwan, for having me. Let's get right to it. So the title of my talk is, Does a dictatorship's first foreign policy actually work? The joke with titles that ask a question is that the answer is always no. And in this case, the answer is no. I'll try to make the case for why that is. So this dictatorship's first foreign policy, in contrast to a democracy-first policy, has defined the US approach for the last 7 to 8 decades. And at the heart of this approach is the idea that people can't be trusted to vote correctly. We like democracy in theory, but we don't like its outcomes in practice. That's the dilemma. And this dilemma was best captured by Reagan's former ambassador to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who said, this is really a great quote, it's a sad one too. She said, quote, "The Arab world is the only part of the world where I've been shaken in my conviction that if you let people decide, they will make fundamentally rational choices," end quote. Yes, the idea here is that Arabs, when given the freedom, will choose incorrectly, basically. We can also call this dictatorship's first foreign policy a stability-first foreign policy. And that gets at a deeper truth, I think. It's not that US policymakers love dictatorship, it's that they think dictatorships promote stability. And stability is what they want more than anything else. So the question then can be rephrased, do authoritarian regimes promote stability? And again, I would say the answer here is no, but there's a catch. In some ways, they do promote stability, but only in the short run. In the medium to long run, it ends up being a very different story. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think that the Arab Spring should have proved this once and for all. It didn't, obviously. But you might recall that just 2 weeks before Mubarak fell, Hillary Clinton famously said, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable." And so the point here is that the Egyptian and Tunisian regimes seemed stable until they weren't, and then it was too late. This is always the kind of deception that authoritarian regimes offer. They give the illusion of stability without any of the substance. And then more recently, we saw the same with the Assad regime. We thought it was stable until it wasn't, and then we were caught off guard by that. The political scientist Nazi Hayubi makes, I think, a very useful distinction between strong states and fierce states. So I would say here that Arab regimes are fierce, but they are not strong. Why? Because they don't enjoy the consent of the governed, and that means that their foundations will always be brittle. They can only rule through the application of force and violence. And this fact means that they can't last forever. They can last for a long time, of course. We see how authoritarian regimes can last for decades. People thought that the Soviet Union at the time was going to last forever, and there was a real fear that the Soviets would overtake the US, but then of course we found out that at its core the Soviet Union was brittle. So we see this lesson time and time again. And there's a really good quote from Michael McFaul in this regard when he says, "The longer a democratic regime survives, the less likely it will collapse. The longer an autocracy survives, the more likely it will collapse." Mike McFaul was a very interesting character because he was a senior advisor to Barack Obama during the Arab Spring, but then he became ambassador to Russia and no longer played as much of a role in U.S. policy towards the Middle East. And that's unfortunate, but there are occasionally policymakers who I think are on the right side of this question. There's just not that many of them. But the Arab Spring is only one data point in, I think, a much broader story. Because I think for as long as my adult life, I think that this is definitely true, the Middle East has been a hotbed of chaos, conflict, and extremism. And if a dictatorship's first foreign policy actually worked, we'd probably see the opposite. But instead, promoting dictatorship, supporting these dictators in the Arab world, it produced a violent Middle East. That is the main lesson, I think, of the last 7 to 8 decades. Almost every single president, with a couple small exceptions in 2004, 2005, and then in 2011, we've pretty much been consistently supporting authoritarian regimes, and the result has always been more chaos and conflict. And I think that policymakers, I mentioned 2004, 2005 as one of the exceptions to this. That was during George W. Bush's Freedom Agenda. And the Freedom Agenda, I think, was important because there was this deeper realization. The thinking was that if Arab citizens didn't have legitimate, peaceful means to express their grievances, they would be more likely to resort to violence. And I think that basic insight was fundamentally correct. As terrible as the Bush administration was, I think intellectually and philosophically on this point, they were basically right. Now, they couldn't follow through with that philosophy in practice. That's always, so sometimes policymakers know what I'm saying, but doing it is actually quite challenging. Finally, I wanted to raise a more recent example of why dictatorship's first foreign policy doesn't work, the Abraham Accords. These were premised on the idea that peace could be possible if dictatorships circumvented their own people. And the Accords also circumvented the Palestinians, marginalizing the Palestinian cause in the broader region. As a result, as we saw, Palestinians grew more desperate and isolated, and a clear aim of the October 7th attacks was to derail the Abraham Accords. We know this because Hamas leaders have said as much. I think there's a real counterfactual here that if the Abraham Accords didn't happen, that October 7th might not have happened. I can't prove that, it's a counterfactual, but I do think that's worth considering. Now, I want to return to the caveat here, and that caveat is we still have to distinguish between short-term stability and long-term stability. And this gets to the reason why the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration couldn't follow through with their initial openness to democracy in the Middle East. It's because of that trade-off. So I think we have to be honest about that. And the political science literature generally agrees that the early phase of democratization can often promote instability. So what do we do about that? I think at some level if we want to promote democracy in the Middle East, we have to accept some short-term instability for the sake of longer-term stability. But this is challenging for policymakers because they're often looking at things in 4 to 8 year windows. And this is a problem that I often faced during the Obama administration. When I would talk to Obama administration officials, they would agree with me in principle. They say, Shadi, you make valid points. You're probably right about the kind of intellectual case for democracy. But the problem is we need X, Y, and Z regime to support us in these interests at this specific time. Your ideas would only come to fruition in 10 to 15 or 20 years. And in the meantime, we'd have to face the fact of instability. So I think our challenge as democracy promotion advocates is how do we persuade policymakers to have a more long-term vision? And I think at some level, the only hope that I see, or one of the hopes that I see, is that if you have policymakers who are ideologically committed to democracy, who have this deeper commitment. I don't think Obama had that deeper commitment. I do think George W. Bush did, but I think that the people around him were skeptical. And George W. Bush actually joked about this. I think it was a summit with Democratic advocates. I forget where it was exactly, but he commented to Saadetdin Ibrahim at the time. He said, "I feel like a dissident in my own state." That and this was kind of funny for him to say because he was the most powerful person in the world at that time, but he still felt that the State Department, Defense Department, intelligence agencies were constraining how pro-democracy the U.S. could be. So I think there's also an institutional obstacle here. But the fundamental point that I just want to end with is that we have to acknowledge the trade-off, and that democracy promotion won't always look pretty, but it is still the best option if we want long-term stability, and ultimately that's what should matter most to us, the long-term question. Thank you.